I have mildly enjoyed Joe Rogan's podcast over the years, usually in those rare occasions where I am compelled to undergo the Joe Rogan Experience. The reason is that the guest on the show inspires nostalgia. My nostalgia is tied to an earlier era of media that I experienced in the late 90s and early aughts, when a show called Coast to Coast AM, hosted by Art Bell, ruled the nighttime airwaves. I've always wanted to make a video where I could talk about how great Art Bell was, especially if you're a kid like me catching it live on AM radio. And an idea presented itself to me. Art's greatest strength as a broadcaster was his skill at interviewing people. Because there are so many parallels between Art Bell's show and Joe Rogan's podcast, right down to some of the most popular guests, it seemed like a perfect way to get across how great Art was on the air, but also an opportunity to explore what separates a great interviewer like Art Bell from a mediocre one like Joe Rogan. This video isn't just a love letter to Art Bell. It's also a love letter to the audio-only format, the theater of the mind. The masters of the airwaves told stories that were so compelling, some of us were lucky enough to have the experience of finding ourselves staying in the car in our own driveway for half an hour as we arrived home so we wouldn't miss a moment of airtime, or staying up way past our bedtime every night to get lost in stories of aliens and the Antichrist and shadow people and God knows what else. Joe Rogan is often credited a different radio show, Opie and Anthony, with inspiring the format of the Joe Rogan Experience. Opie and Anthony, for those not in the know, was a shock jock show in the vein of Howard Stern, but with more of a hangout, conversational vibe that included having a rotating cast of comedians and weirdos in the studio, along with the hosts. I actually think that Joe is dead wrong about what influenced his show format. In my opinion, Joe's show owes a huge debt to Coast AM with Art Bell and not Opie and Anthony. Rather than having a cast of characters narrating alongside him, Art Bell ran his show alone, with the sometimes help of his wife Ramona, who was almost always behind the scenes like young Jamie on JRE. Art would do long-form interviews about paranormal and extraterrestrial topics, but he would also mix in a wide range of other subjects. Art was not a one-trick pony. He had a unique curiosity about the world, and his news junkie background from his previous incarnation on the radio as a more conventional DJ and talk radio host influenced the subjects he would discuss on the show. Objectively, the actual format of the Joe Rogan Experience is much closer to the Art Bell template than the shock jock morning zoo radio style of Opie and Anthony or Howard Stern. The biggest difference between Joe Rogan and Art Bell was that Art was a billion times better at broadcasting. Art hosted the show by himself and ran his own boards and took his own calls without a call screener, which was very unique and led to some amazing moments when he'd have open lines. More to the point, Art was a much better interviewer than Joe. Thankfully, for this video, Joe ripped off so much from Art's show, we can make a number of direct comparisons because many of Joe's most interesting guests, as I mentioned in the beginning, were originally guests on Coast to Coast decades earlier. We're going to be looking at interviews with Bob Lazar, the guy who says he worked on alien spacecraft at Area S4 near Area 51, and Graham Hancock, the alternative history researcher and author of books like Fingerprints of the Gods. There are many other guests that crossed over on both programs, but Lazar and Hancock were the first names that sprung to my mind. I think they make sense in terms of comparing the interviewing style of Joe Rogan and Art Bell because both Lazar and Hancock are widely known to podcast listeners. Both are representative of key areas of interest for the two shows, Joe Rogan and Art Bell, that overlap. And both Lazar and Hancock are guests that have a higher than average degree of difficulty to interview because of their idiosyncrasies. For example, Graham Hancock has a habit of filibustering and going on long, meandering monologues and needs to be reined in. Bob Lazar stands in total contrast as an interview subject in that Lazar needs to be warmed up by a welcoming host, and Lazar tends to respond in short, clipped sentences if the interviewer is asking poorly thought out questions that are not open-ended or questions that lead into areas outside of Lazar's interest or direct knowledge. So let's take a ride to the high desert and the great American Southwest, back in time to the dawn of the internet era, to a time when the information superhighway was still frisky and there was high strangeness to be heard on the AM radio dial. I've gone ahead and listened to a bunch of back episodes of Art Bell and the Joe Rogan Experience, and we'll look at clips and compare and contrast how Joe and Art interviewed Graham Hancock and Bob Lazar. Okay, so to start off with here, we're going to look at the intros to two different episodes involving interviews of Bob Lazar. The first one we're going to look at is a Joe Rogan Experience interview number 1315 with Bob Lazar and the extremely annoying Jeremy Corbell. And we're going to contrast that to the intro of a Bob Lazar interview with Art Bell. In the beginning of this episode on the Joe Rogan Experience, Joe gives a short preamble where he says he's followed Bob's story incredibly closely for years. And then Joe himself tries to recount the basic outline of Bob's story. And in doing so, we see Joe stumble at the first hurdle, though, making a pretty big inaccuracy in trying to cover Bob's story. This is the kind of thing that if you don't have an intro prepared, you might want to throw it to Bob. As you know, as I mentioned, Bob can be sometimes a little bit reticent as an interview subject, sometimes difficult to get open up. So this is the exact kind of like softball question that would be maybe good to ask Bob about to help open him up. Just ask him to give like a brief recounting of the outline of his story. But instead, Joe tries to do it himself for whatever reason, and we'll see the result here.
I first heard your story decades ago. I told you last night we went out to dinner. I've seen pretty much every interview you've ever given. I've followed the story incredibly closely. But for people who don't know the story, let's give them the bullet points. You used to work at Area 51. And Area 51, you went like, huh?
Well, we want to be accurate.
Okay.
Area S4.
S4, okay.
It's about 15 miles south of Area 51.
So to contrast the opening of the Joe Rogan episode with Bob Lazar, here we have an episode where Art Bell interviewed Bob Lazar in 2002. This is the June 6th Coast to Coast AM with Bob Lazar. And we'll hear Art give a prepared intro. And the other thing that's really great about Art, and I think something that radio people were much better at, was setting up things during the breaks that were built into the show, the commercial breaks. So before this intro, Art promoted this interview a few different times with short mentions that Bob Lazar was going to be on. So here we hear Art give the intro talking about how Bob has new info and kind of giving an update on what Bob's up to. At this point, he was just beginning the process of making a movie, which I don't think ever happened. And the other thing that I really like about this intro is that Art relates it to himself, talking about how Bob always talks about how he doesn't like to do interviews, or was fairly reluctant to do interviews, despite there being like a 7 gigabyte archive of Bob Lazar material online. But anyway, so I just really love the way that Art sets us up and asks the first question. You can tell that Art Bell immediately connects with Bob Lazar and seems to put him at ease and make him comfortable. So we'll listen to this clip and then we'll move on to the next comparison.
In the mid-1980s, a fascinating story emerged. A man claiming to have worked out at a test site designated S4, which is part of the Groom Lake test site, came forward to tell his remarkable story to local Las Vegas news anchor George Knapp. I'll bet you George Knapp was out there at the Kreskin affair tonight with cameras. The man was Robert S. Lazar. Bob never claimed to have made contact with, worked with, or has ever seen any aliens at S4. But he did claim to have worked on a revolutionary propulsion system, seen saucer-shaped craft in a hangar built into the side of the mountain, and had witnessed live trials of a man flying disc. His story made headlines around the world, brought hundreds of thousands of people to the desert, spawned a multi-million-dollar publishing and merchandising circus, and shook up a country to the core of its beliefs. It is worth noting that for nearly 15 years now, Bob Lazar has never tried to embellish his story, change it, and neither the U.S. military nor the government has ever denied any of it to be true. Bob Lazar, the man behind the legend of Area 51, as the center of a massive U.S. government cover-up surrounding crashed alien spacecraft, has recently signed a deal with UK-based Blue Book Films to finally bring his unique story to the screen. And this is a man who does not do interviews. He's even worse than I am. I mean, he's very shy, probably somewhat reclusive. I get accused of being reclusive a lot, and I am. And I guess Bob is too. Bob, are you reclusive?
I guess you could say that.
Yeah.
Okay, so in this next set of clips, we're going to be looking at a comparison between an episode with Graham Hancock on the Joe Rogan Experience, episode number 1284, and an episode where Hancock appears on Art Bell. And these clips are from about the same time into the relative conversations. Both are from around 4 or 5 minutes into the conversation after the intro. And what these clips show in my mind is the knock-on effect of the intro, what happens after that, how you start the interview and set the tone with your first volley of questions. In this first clip that we're going to watch in the Joe Rogan Experience, the first 4 or so minutes of this episode are really Graham Hancock plugging his own speaking tour in the US and Canada and mentioning the title of his new book and stuff like that. The issue with that, I think, is that if you don't know who Graham is, all of this info is very confusing. And we'll contrast this to how Art sets the table, or you can look at the previous clip where we did the intro. I think in some sense this has to do with like a larger point about how the media has changed to some degree over the last 50 odd years. Newspapers especially, I go back and read a lot of archival newspapers and magazines. I love old periodicals, and old newspapers, from like the 60s and 70s especially, would always recap the basics of a big story when a new follow-up story would be printed. Nowadays, if you look at online periodicals or anything else really, it's sort of assumed that you can search up the context of the story for yourself. And we lose something in that, I think. In a show like Joe's, though, I think he really should spend a minute or two setting up the context of the guest at the outset. Otherwise, you get situations like this where Graham Hancock goes off and filibusters for the first few minutes talking about his book tour, and then we see Joe kind of trying to have to catch up and set the tone in the interview by asking this first question. In this clip, I'm just going to show you like a very sped up, it's like a super sped up version of like the first few minutes so you can just sort of see what goes on, and then we'll stop and show you how Joe sort of struggles to get the train on the tracks after Graham's hijacking of the intro. The other thing I want to mention is the element that I think Art would really add was that his interviews always had like an arc or a storytelling pattern for the interview that made it so easy to follow and get lost in. So we'll watch this clip of Rogan first, and then we'll see a contrasting clip from an Art Bell interview with Graham Hancock.
But it's a joy. It's a really opportunity for me to interact with the people who actually make my work matter. So
that's fantastic, beautiful. So what inspired this? I know there's always been. Well, you first of all, we should just say for people who don't know, you have been at the front of the line for decades, talking about these lost civilizations. And from reading your work, I mean, I think I first read your work in the 90s.
So this next clip is from an Art Bell interview with Graham Hancock from 1996. This is the November 7th edition of Coast to Coast AM. And the first couple minutes are, again, Art setting up and introing Hancock. It's a really fantastic intro where Art talks about like all the different time zones Graham's in, because these clips are very similar in that Graham had been doing speaking or book tours at the time of both this 1996 interview and the later Joe Rogan interview that we just watched. But in this one, we're going to go to around 4 minutes into the conversation where after the intro, Art asks really his first question. And the thing I want to emphasize here is the way that Art formats his questions to really bridge the subject from one topic to another. And Art is so great at this. He hits Graham with a pass like a quarterback who hits a wide receiver right on the numbers in stride, allowing forward progress with no hesitation. And I just think that there really was an art to the way that Art Bell would interview people, and you come to really appreciate those subtleties over listening to hundreds of hours. So let's take a listen to the way that Art opens up the interview and begins the conversation with Graham in this 1996 interview about the Sphinx and Egypt.
Why do you think that this whole genre of investigation, this whole area, has gone so absolutely
crazy. I mean, it just is exploding all over the world, not just here in the U.S.
That's right. It's a universal phenomenon. It's happening everywhere, and I think that what it is that people are waking up everywhere to the big questions,
Yes.
getting less focused on trivial day-by-day issues and asking themselves very, very large questions about who we are and why we are here and what is, and you know, it sounds like the ultimate cliche, but what is the meaning of life? What is it all for?
Okie dokie. Well, I don't want to belabor the point too much. I have a ton more notes and I could keep going on for sure, but I just really wanted to point out how great Art Bell was and how much fun it is going back and revisiting the show. There's a ton of clips even on YouTube and full shows even, and I'll leave a link to a couple shows that I really enjoy that are available on YouTube if anybody wants to check him out. And you know, the other thing I just want to mention really briefly here in tying everything up is there's so much in these shows that's still relevant today. And Art really was a huge pioneer, especially in terms of integrating the internet into a show. He was probably like the first radio person or person on live media to integrate like webcams. Like he had all that kind of stuff going back in the 90s, and he had a great website where people could go look at photos and stuff like that over 30 years ago. And so his show was really super ahead of its time. And, you know, one other thing I just want to mention really briefly is like going back and listening to some of these shows that are really etched in my mind. And one of the things I had forgotten about and that it definitely has a lot of relevance to today is when I was going back and listening to a 2002 Coast to Coast AM show with Graham Hancock. He reports on this really fascinating story that I'd kind of forgotten about, where there was a group of Chechen rebels that had taken over a theater in Russia to try to force and taken a bunch of Russian hostages to try to force Russia to end the war in Chechnya. This was on the, as I mentioned, the October 23rd, 2002 Coast to Coast AM show, and the story was developing at the time, but I went back and like did some reading to refresh my memory on this, because what I really remembered was the way that the whole thing ended was that the Russians ended up gassing the theater with what they referred to at the time as sleeping gas, but is now generally accepted to be an aerosolized form of fentanyl. And it ended up causing a lot of casualties. It's a really crazy thing. And there's a whole Wikipedia article that's very in depth on what's known as the Moscow theater hostage crisis. But then there's just all sorts of things like this that are sometimes little forgotten historical relics or just interesting things to follow up on. Also around the same time, there's the DC Sniper was active, and so there's another bulletin on that. Art, as I mentioned, like to recap the news before bringing on guests usually, and so these shows are just fascinating time capsules and also have a lot of relevance to today. So I go back and revisit my collection of Art Bell MP3s all the time, just because they're more interesting than the stuff that's available on YouTube or other sources these days. To me, at times, they're really great to listen to, especially at night. So anyway, thanks for checking out the video. I'll definitely be open to making more content about Art Bell, and a lot of this stuff is all just stored in my brain box. So yeah, give him a listen if you haven't heard of him before, and thanks for checking out the channel.